everyone, and welcome to my review of The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, which takes place right after the Desolation of Smaug. Remember, this is just my opinion, and the right opinion is my opinion. I would love to hear your opinion. Thanks. And let's start off with the things that I liked. Once again, the scenery in this movie is really on point. It really conveys the emotion of what's going on, as well as the tone in this movie is great. Some of the costumes also convey a lot of emotion, have a lot of depth and detail, and that's absolutely what I love. Of course, it's New Zealand. They have some extremely beautiful sets to look at, and some really inspirational moments that make you go, oh, just like in The Return of the King. Sadly, I do have a few issues with this movie. Smaug is attacking Lake Town. I find that this should have been the end of the Desolation of Smaug, because at the end of the second one, they had the lead up to this big finale, and they had the lead up and the setup. Here it just feels like the payoff, so it could muddle how satisfying the end is. It depends a bit on the previous one, so at times it could feel like it doesn't stand on its own or tell its own story. Like if you look at the Lord of the Rings, each one followed what happened in the previous movies, but it still followed a different thing and told a different story. Also, that this opening scene, another reason that I find it should have been at the ending of the Desolation of Smaug, is it really feels like kind of like a prologue to the whole plot in this movie, because it just feels a bit out of place. It didn't feel like it exactly made sense, because it took this action scene to get the plot going. The same issues that I have with the first two I still have here, which is the consistency in this movie, because I remember that basically each story was about telling its own and one precise and concise goal. In the first two, it was about reclaiming Erebor. But sadly, in the first two, they also introduced the other plotline of Azog, which kind of could take away from the main plot in this movie, and it could feel a bit out of place. I find that here, this conflict right after Smaug was defeated should have been more internal rather than depending more on a different plot. Sally didn't contribute much to the overall plot, didn't exactly take the setup from the first two. Same thing with the pacing, is I find here the pacing especially was stretched out a bit too much. The problem is it's hard to identify a clear beginning, middle, end in a movie that's dedicated to one battle, and it could definitely make a lot of things seem just stretched out in unnecessary ways. And sadly, some of the CGI in this battle wasn't the greatest. I wasn't the biggest fan of the CGI in this movie. At times you could tell that it was definitely CGI. The CGI that they did on the orcs, I wasn't the biggest fan of, definitely. It just looked fake. It removed a lot of the grit and the sense of realism and dread and tension. Also, this movie definitely also relied heavily on references that could also muddle this story from telling its own cohesive story. Here you have something due to Sauron, and they just have some references, like you remember that, just felt a bit out of place. As well as another problem that I had with this movie is that most of the aftermath in this movie were left unfinished, which I found weird. Like a lot of questions still remained unanswered, which could really muddle the story a lot, or the conclusion of the story, which is what this story is supposed to be. Like, I have no idea what happened to the Arkenstone, what happened to the dwarves, what happened to Alfred, what happened to Bard. I find that this movie should have had a clear aftermath. Now let's talk a bit about dragon sickness. I find that Thorn's turn to get the dragon sickness was a bit rushed. Definitely, I could see it building up in the Desolation of Smaug, but really, it was more about reclaiming Erebor, but just even in that movie, you could tell there's a bit rushed because he wanted to reclaim his homeland. Yay! Here, it just felt like at times he just turned just because it's not him too, which could feel a bit rushed. Also, the fact that no one else got dragon sickness, I've always wondered about that. Why exactly? Same thing with the character called Alfred, I also wasn't the biggest fan of. As well as the romance here, the first one was a bit rushed. Here it still feels a bit rushed as well. This movie also has some over-the-top scenes that make you go, what? Especially with Legolas. Like some moments that Legolas does, you're just like, what?
That's not how the Force works.
As well as some of these plot conveniences, like some of these incredible creatures appear ooh, and they just disappear. Where do they go? Overall, I find this movie definitely should have been a bit more concise, and that really didn't need to be there. It was stretched out a bit too much, and it didn't have a clear beginning, middle, and end, but the big thing is the fact that in the Hobbit book, they didn't focus the most on Aesop because they wanted to keep a clear, concise story. Here, they didn't exactly do that, so it could feel a bit out of place. I find it would have been way better if this conflict was more internal about these characters rather than these orcs. And overall, I'll give The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, a C-. Sadly, didn't enjoy this movie as much as they thought it would. Quick soundtrack review. I actually liked the soundtrack here. Definitely wasn't as good as the soundtracks in The Lord of the Rings. Some of the action cues could feel a bit generic at times, but overall I find that this was a better soundtrack with better action cues and more emotional cues. And overall I'll give the soundtrack a 9.1 out of 10.